Hi everyone, welcome back. Happy Friday. So we're going to try to wrap up metabolism again. There's a lot more in the chapter that we would love to cover, but frankly we just don't have time. Because again, we're trying to really get through the urinary system. Like with the urinary system and the reproductive system, it's kind of like the digestive system. The gross anatomy is pretty easy, but when you get to down to the brass tacks and how it actually functions, that's where it gets a little tricky, especially with the nephron. But for today, we're just going to talk about anatomy of the urinary system. All right, so let's get to the urinary system. Okay, so the disclaimer. So this lecture doesn't really have nudity. I try to draw as much as I can, but now we have to talk about the genitalia, and this is why you will see genitals from this point on in the semester. So I think maybe not next net lecture, but once we start talking about the reproductive system, we will have to actually go to unlisted. So everything will be on Laulima, the link. But I can't have it public because all my reproductive system, even though it's educational, like YouTube allows educational nudity, even though if it's drawings, everything is age restricted, like by default. They see reproduction, they automatically slam that onto all the videos. So you'll have to log in as well. All right, so mostly drawings, but there might be a few clinical photographs. Again, everything is censored or just obscure to the point where you can kind of tell what's going on. But yeah, to coincide with YouTube's content policies. All right, so detoxing. So detox. Oh, you may have heard of there's a 3 day, here's a 6 day detox, or try this juice cleanse, or try this detox method. But what is detox? And when you hear that, it's always a red flag to me because usually somebody is going to sell their method of detox, or they're going to say this method is the best. And so there are many detoxes and cleanses. What is the best, or with all of these out there, what is the best detoxification system? How are you supposed to know that? Well, the best detoxification system is this organ right here because it has many enzymes. Like your liver, it receives all the blood from your intestines, has many enzymes that can actually metabolize the different compounds from your digestive system that's found in your bloodstream, and it also can take things like drugs or any sort of toxic chemicals, use its chemistry set of enzymes to alter them so that they can be excreted from your body. So this is why your liver is the underappreciated goat of your body, because it does so many things. It's involved in pretty much almost all your systems in your body. But so my other question for the people who sell these is what toxins are being detoxed? And toxin actually has a very specific definition. So a toxin, in its strictest definition, is some sort of poison secreted by an organism, so something living. Now, something being toxic, so toxic and toxin, there is a slight difference. So there might be talking about some toxic chemicals. So toxic chemicals would have the ability to harm our cells and tissues or just our overall health. Toxicant is a more specific term, so it's talking about something that's artificial and with toxic properties. So toxicants aren't the same as toxins. So with these detoxes, what are they getting rid of, or what toxicants are they getting rid of? Or are they talking about toxins and talking about how to get rid of some sort of spider toxin or some being bit by some organism? So how to get rid of toxicants? That liver does so much in terms of sometimes it just excretes into bile, or it might change it or inactivate it by changing the chemical structure of that toxicant, or it could also change it so that it's less hydrophobic and make it hydrophilic, so that you can dump it into urine. So speaking of which, what's the liver's best buddy in terms of detoxification? It's also the kidneys. So the kidneys are very important, just like getting rid of all those excess B vitamins. They're also very important in getting rid of toxicants that are converted by the liver to water soluble, or sometimes these toxicants are water soluble in themselves. Okay, so what are the main functions of the urinary system? So we know that, okay, we urinate every day, or hopefully you do, but we excrete waste, so that's what we have to do with our urinary system. But the main function is to maintain homeostasis in your body, especially metabolic homeostasis, and maintain normal levels of chemicals in your body. So what it's going to do is reabsorb vital nutrients and essential chemicals, because why? Well, the thing about urine, it's made from ultra filtrated blood. So if you filtered all the chemicals in your blood through in urine and didn't reabsorb it, then you would lose nutrients every time you urinate. And you do lose a limited amount, but you would lose a lot more if you didn't reabsorb it. But also balance blood chemistry. So the urinary system can also balance your pH inside your body and also balance the concentration of ions and minerals and electrolytes in your blood as well. So the urinary system is not just about just producing urine. It's also about the bigger picture is that it maintains chemical balance inside your body. Now here are the main organs of the urinary system, very easy. We have our kidneys, we have our ureters that lead from the kidneys to the urinary bladder, and then we have our urethra. So again, the urethra differently shaped between the female and male body, but in kidneys, ureters, and urinary bladder are pretty much the same. Alright, so kidney trauma. So where can't you punch in combat sports? And yes, I did see that Mike Tyson video, and I won't make further comment, but I'm like, it's like that saying, if you poke a bear, expect to get eaten. That's my thoughts on that. But where can't you punch in combat sports like boxing and MMA? You can't punch things like your opponent's back, so you can't do that. And you can't punch below the belt for obvious reasons, especially if it's male boxing. And you can't punch the back of the head or the neck, or what they also call a rabbit punch, because again, if you've taken the PHYL 141 or AMP1, you know that the medulla oblongata and all the brainstem that controls your cardiovascular and respiratory system is located in that brainstem. So you don't want to have trauma and damage that, because that could kill somebody. Or in the kidneys, a kidney punch right here. So that's also illegal. And why is that? Well, if you look at the posterior view of the kidneys, here we have the rib cage, and here we have our 12th rib, so this ends there. So notice that the kidneys are slightly exposed. There is a fleshy part where it's not protected by bone over here. Now, with the kidneys, so the 11th and 12th ribs, again, 12 pairs of ribs, you don't have protections on the inferior part of the kidneys. So here's the left and right kidney, because we're looking at the back. Now, here's like a transverse or a horizontal view, like cut someone in half like those magicians do, and you look at this. Well, say someone punches here. Where are they going to, from the anterior and front, where are they going to encounter? They're going to encounter like abdominal muscles. They're also going to encounter the rib cage as well. So you also have the things like here we have our stomach. So the kidneys are pretty well insulated from the front. But if you punch from the back, and especially like below the rib cage, that can cause trauma to the kidneys. So this is why those kidney punches are illegal, because they're pretty exposed from the back over there, and also side. Now back to looking in the front. So what we're looking at is the kidneys, but there's actually, if you cut someone open from the anterior, you're not going to see the kidneys presented up in front like this. You actually have to move certain organs and tissues out of the way first. So what organs and tissues would you find in front of the, so say you're doing a cadaver dissection and then you open up the abdomen, what would you see initially? So you'd see, or actually before we even get to that, so what we see here is like actually a muscular wall in the back of the kidneys. That's what we're seeing. So this is toward the back of our abdomen and in our lower back. Now what you would see if you cut someone open is you would see something like this. So you see all our liver, our digestive organs. So if you've taken the lab, you know that to see the kidneys in the fetal pigs, you actually need to remove all these digestive organs in order to actually get to the kidneys. And if you did a really delicate dissection, what you might have also noticed is that there was also a sheet that was in front of the kidneys, kind of like a little shrink wrap, and this was the peritoneum. So the kidneys are actually located where what we call retroperitoneal. So they're behind the peritoneum. So if you did a delicate dissection, you had to cut away this peritoneum to actually look at the kidneys. So retroperitoneal means that behind the peritoneum. So this is why you don't see the kidneys up in front when you're dissecting from the anterior. You actually have to cut away the peritoneum to actually look at that. And if you've seen like the hollowed out pig carcass, you also know this is why it was kind of like a boat and like a cavity, right? Because of this muscular wall in the behind. And then there's also the adrenal glands, but that was when we talked about the, so again, the adrenal glands, very important, but they're different. They sit on top of the kidneys, but they're not part of the kidneys. So they're a different organ with different purposes. All right, so then we have the ureters. These lead from the kidneys to the bladder. So retroperitoneal, do you need to know which organs are retroperitoneal, like the kidney, or the ones that are like or before intraperitoneal. So I think for the MCAT and nursing school, those are common questions on the NCLEX, so you probably will have to learn those as well. So retroperitoneal, and it also gets a little tricky as well, because like for the intestines, sometimes they weave in and out of the peritoneum, so some are in front of the peritoneum, some are behind the peritoneums. But for this class, I'm not really focusing much on that, but if you're going on to advanced studies, just letting you know that this is something that might come up. Alright, so then we have our left kidney and our right kidney gross anatomy, but look at how they're arranged, and especially with their horizontal arrangement to each other. Notice that the left kidney and right kidney are not completely flush and on equal levels with each other. So if you look at the horizontal orientation, you notice that the right kidney is slightly displaced downward and inferior. And why is that? Well, it's due to what's sitting right on top of that. So the kidneys are not at the same horizontal level because you have the liver. And the liver, even though it has a left and right lobe, these lobes are far from symmetrical. And you remember you also have the caudal and quadrate. But yeah, due to that huge right lobe, that's why we have the downward displacement of the right kidney. Now with the left and right kidney, what's going to happen is that they're going to get, or here we have the abdominal aorta carrying blood and fresh oxygenated blood, and this is going to the left and right renal arteries. So these renal arteries are going to be filtered, and there's also going to be reabsorption of chemicals and the solutes in water as well. But whatever is not reabsorbed back into the circulatory system ends up as urine. But whatever returns to the circulatory system ends up returning via the veins and back to the heart via the inferior vena cava. Now, what happens to that urine that isn't reclaimed from the urinary system? Yeah, so then you have the ureters. The ureters are going to carry the urine from each kidney down to the bladder, and then the bladder stores urine until it's safe to urinate, void, micturate, many different words for that. But yeah, that's where you store all that urine that's finally produced by those kidneys. So here are the learning goals and key points from that. And yep, the liver is the reason why that the kidneys are not at the same level. So often when people draw a cartoon, they draw a kidney at the same level, but they're actually not on the same level. Okay, so the kidney itself, pretty easy anatomy. I'll just do it very quickly. So what we have here are many layers, but just like many of the other organs in our body, what you have from going from superficial and outer to deep and inner is that you have a capsule. So this is like a layer of like dense connective tissue that helps to protect and insulate the kidney from the other parts of the body. And then you have something called the renal cortex, and you also have something called the renal medulla. So the medulla and cortex, again, in general, if there's a cortex and a medulla in an organ or tissue, the cortex tends to be outer, the medulla tends to be inner, and the same goes for the kidney. Now, what we have here with the medulla is that the medulla is made out of these substructures called renal pyramids. And again, they look like triangles because if you take a pyramid and just do a slice through one, you'll have a triangular cross section. So this is why, but if in terms of their 3D shape, they're called renal pyramids. Now, the renal pyramids all together, this makes up the renal medulla. Now, the renal cortex, again, this is going to be a more outer layer, so the renal cortex is going to be outer in terms of like, in relative to the medulla. So the renal cortex is this part right here, but the renal cortex also extends between each renal pyramid in these things called renal columns. So renal columns, notice that they're kind of like elongated and skinny, so that's why they call them renal columns. So between each renal pyramid, or between renal pyramids, you have renal columns. Now, what you have here is like a renal pyramid, and here we have two columns that are surrounding it. So when you take half a column and a renal pyramid, here it's kind of like it's what you call a renal lobe. So renal lobes are like this, and if you've taken the lab, I mean, some Ts, they know how to do this as well. But sometimes if you can actually like separate the renal lobes, they're kind of like, I like to think of them like when you cut through an orange, if they're orange wedge segments, those segments are kind of like renal lobes. So they include like these slices over here, the one renal pyramid, but also the surrounding columns, or half the surrounding columns. So between each pyramid, or between each renal lobes, they would share a renal column. All right. Okay, so then blood supply to the kidneys. Now the blood supply, we need the arteries carrying blood away from the heart, and now it's going to go to the kidneys, and you also have blood that's returning from the kidneys, whatever is not turned into urine. Alright, so from the renal artery, you have these renal arteries branching into what we call segmental arteries, and from these segmental arteries, now they end up between the lobes, and that's why I'm making a big deal about these lobes, because these arteries that go between each lobes, these are called interloper arteries. So inter, again, that useful prefix meaning between. So these arteries are literally between renal lobes. Now, between these renal lobes, we have these interloper arteries, and what they're going to do is take a left or right turn, and they're going to do kind of like a turn around these pyramids, and this is what you call arcuate arteries. So these renal arcuate arteries are going to turn from the interloper arteries and go left or right, or skirt around these pyramids. Then these arteries are going to branch and radiate out like spokes of a wheel. So these are called cortical radiate arteries. So again, why? Again, this is the renal cortex, the outer layer, so it's radiating out into the cortex. So this is one of the few times I like anatomy because it's very this is one of the easier types of anatomy because this actually kind of makes sense. Like they actually describe where things are. So this is, I think, a really good question to ask. Like, what's the blood flow to and from a kidney? So what we have are the renal arteries, and they branch and branch and branch. They go between the lobes. They hook around with these arcuate arteries. They radiate with these cortical radiate arteries. They end up these smaller blood arteries called afferent arterioles, and then they end up in the nephron. But we're saving that for another lecture. So the nephron is going to, whatever isn't turned into urine and filtrate by the nephron is going to return to your circulatory system. And hey, notice that a lot of these veins are just the same names, but vein and also in reverse. So that's why I think like renal blood supply is a lot easier than other circulatory anatomy. Alright, so when we look at here we have the kidney, and it's talking about the different types of arteries. But if we zoom in on one of these lobes, what do we see are these little balls over here, and they're actually not really like smooth spheres. They're actually small tangled capillaries, so that's why they look like cherry tomatoes, but they're not spheres. That's what I'm getting at here. So these are what you call glomeruli, these little balls of capillaries over here, and they lead to something called a nephron. Now, here's a nephron, and here's that ball of so that little like cherry tomato looking thing, that's actually this special type of capillary we call a glomerulus, and it leads to this windy, twisty tube we call a nephron. Now, the nephron has many different types, like the substructures and types of cells and functions. We'll cover that in another lecture, but what we have is that capillary called the glomerulus, a capsule that surrounds it, and then it goes through this tube, and there's different parts of this tube as well. Then a nephron ends up in something we call a collecting system. So there's the collecting duct that initially collects filtrate and urine from a nephron, and then you have the papillary duct. Now, with these collecting ducts, it's not one-to-one with the nephron and these collecting ducts. So what we see with this image here from the OpenStax version is that we have these little branches. So these branches are actually from different nephrons. So you can have several nephrons that collect from into the same collecting duct right here. It's just not showing you all of them just for simplicity's sake, but my main point here is that nephrons and collecting ducts are not one-to-one. You have many nephrons leading to the same general collecting duct. So this is what you tend to find mostly in the renal medulla, is that you find these collecting ducts and also these parts of the nephron that dip down toward the center part of a kidney. Alright, so back to the overall structure of a kidney. So we have our collecting ducts in these renal pyramids. So notice that this is how urine is made. So again, our blood supply goes out toward the cortex, but when you filter urine and filter blood and make it into urine, they end up traveling back down in the renal medulla, and they end up in these renal pyramids, and they come out on this end right here. So what we have here are these minor calyces. So these parts that collect the urine from each of the pyramids, this is what we call a minor calyx, or calyces for plural. And then it ends up in larger calyces we call major calyces. So a major calyx would be like here, here, and here. And then finally it ends up in something we call the renal pelvis over here, and that's where it finally ends up going past something called the hilum, and then into the ureters, where it eventually collects into the bladder. All right, and the ureters itself, I don't expect you to know too much about this, but at this level, but it is a tube, and what it has is like a mucosa. Yes, Mr. Peanut, it's very exciting. Okay, so then transitional epithelia. So we have a transitional epithelia is like, if you remember your histology from PHYL, Anatomy and Physiology 1, PHYL 1 for 1, is that transitional epithelia, they don't quite fit into that squamous, cuboidal, or columnar. They're very stretchy, so when they're relaxed, they can kind of look columnar or cuboidal, but when they're stretched out, they can actually look flatter and squamous. So they're transitional because they're flexible, they don't quite have a fixed shape. Then you have the lamina propria that's anchoring this epithelium to the outer layers, and then you have a layer of smooth muscle. So the ureters actually can do their own form of peristalsis, so they can squeeze the contents of urine down to the bladder. And there's also outer connective tissue as well. Now here's the ureters, and again the ureters, they have smooth muscles, so they can constrict and propel and move along the urine down to the bladder as well by constricting. So it's not just by gravity, you have some help with the smooth muscle in the ureters. Alright, so that was the gross anatomy of the urinary system. So we talked about the kidney and the ureters very briefly. Now we're ending up at the bladder. So this is what I'm going to try to cover here. So what we have here, so how can someone write something in snow with urine? So shouldn't you eat yellow snow? Well, I mean, if you ever lived in a place with snow, you might have done this. I've never been able to do it because it's way too cold. But yeah, so you can also do that by writing your snow. And you say, oh, only males can do this. But actually, it's really cool. Like I think this was invented, where is it, 2015? But it's found that actually, like for my female friends who like to go camping, they say this has been really useful because now they don't have to find a toilet and squat down. They can just use this device and go standing up. So now females can also write their names in snow if they have good control of certain muscles. Now, micturition. Let's talk about micturition. So, aka voiding, many names for it. So, voiding, uresis, urination, but micturition is like the physiological term for it. Now, how do you know when you need to micturate? So there's many things that can involve, but let's talk about the basics of micturition. So here's a generic bladder, and this is showing a female bladder because it's not lacking an organ that's like in the male bladder and urinary system. You actually have the prostate gland between the internal and external urethral sphincter. So this is female because we don't have a prostate gland there, or it's just showing you it in general. Now, with the urethral sphincters, they're just like, you remember how our digestive system, there's also an external and internal sphincter as well. So you kind of like have the same system going on in your urinary system. So internal urethral sphincters in both the female and male urinary system, you have both types of sphincters, but they're slightly differently arranged. But in general, in terms of their control, the internal urethral sphincter in both females and males, this is involuntary smooth muscle, so that means you can't control this one. So sympathetic activity is going to contract it, and why is that? Well, again, with our sympathetic activity and sympathetic response, that's the fight or flight. It's not the time to rest and digest or urinate and defecate. So parasympathetic is going to relax it. So sympathetic activity, this is why like people during a track meet, hopefully if they didn't have the sympathetic activity that was holding on to their urethral sphincter, then it would be like a horse race. Yeah, it would be a very messy track because people wouldn't be controlling their bladders and constricting their bladders during sympathetic activity. So again, parasympathetic is when it's downtime and time to do diuresis. That's why it relaxes that. Now, external urethral sphincters, these are skeletal muscle, and again, not skeletal muscle in terms of like anchoring and moving a joint, but more that this is voluntary control. So this is the one we're controlling and holding on to if we need to urinate, and then we can release when it's safe to do so. So that's why it's skeletal muscle, because it's voluntary. Now here we're showing a very, very cartoony version of the female reproductive system over here. So there are 3 orifices, so openings to and from the body. So here we have the digestive system with the rectum and anus. And then we have the vagina that leads to and from the uterus. And then the urinary bladder is going to be, and the urinary system is going to be the most forward-facing, front-facing, and anterior of this. So the urinary bladder is here, and that leads to, so you have the internal urethral sphincter right here at the base of the bladder, and then that leads to the over here we have the part of the urethra that leads to the external urethral sphincter, and then you have the opening over here. So the urethra is going to carry urine from the bladder to the outside, and now you have voiding and micturition. So you have, just like the digestive system, you have the double seal that keeps both, so you have two stops that prevents urine from leaking out. Alright, so here we have the male reproductive system, and again, very cartoony, but again, just two orifices because there's no uterus here. And what we have here is, okay, the urinary is going to be, bladders fill up, and then we have this urethra, and there's different parts because there's actually that prostatic urethra because there's a prostate gland in the male body over here. So the prostatic urethra is the part that runs through the prostate, and then through this part right here. So when we talk about the male reproductive system, we'll talk about the spongy part of the penis as well. But what we have is like different, the urethra has different regions over here, and then it ends up at an external urethral orifice. So, but just like the female reproductive system, there are two stops. We have internal and external. So what happens when you have voluntary control, and this is how like you're able to write your name in the snow. It's due to that voluntary control of that external urethral sphincter because it's voluntary skeletal muscle. So this is how but maybe some people have better handwriting. Again, I don't have experience with this, but it's all due to the control of that external urethral sphincter that's voluntarily controlled. Now, what happens with the male, and this is like a little pro tip for those of us who have male reproductive organs, is that, okay, so a little like sharing you bathroom secrets, like sometimes you might see different guys, like they have different ways of shaking things out, because why? Well, notice that the last spot of control is this external urethral sphincter. So what if your male is urinating, and then you still have a little urine left over here in the urethra? How do you get that out? So some guys shake, sometimes squeeze, sometimes do little dances as well. So one tip for, if you have found that like, okay, sometimes like you might have a little dribble left over because you actually had some urine left over here in the urethra. So one tip you can do is like, where else you can actually press over here, and by squeezing over here, that can help to coax some of the extra urine out so that you're able to get rid of that extra urine so it doesn't end up dribbling out into your underwear. So this is one like pro tip for the males out there. That's one way you can do that, because again, we can't control what's here downstream of the external urethral sphincter. Alright, so then what's another thing that can affect micturition in males is that also, this is actually a consequence of just aging. Like, it's normal for the prostate to get bigger with age, and again, the prostatic urethra runs through the prostate gland. So something that can happen, that often happens with aging, is what we call hyperplasia. And it's not cancer, it's not different from prostate cancer. It's a natural increase in the mass and size of this prostate gland with age. Now, what happens when it increases with this mass and size is it also narrows the prostatic urethra. So remember how like blood flow, like the smaller the radius, the more resistance you have to flow, and the slower that liquid flows through blood vessels. Same thing with the prostatic urethra. If the radius decreases in size, that's going to impede flow. So that's why a common problem with men who are advanced in age is that they complain about difficulty with urination due to this swelling of the prostate gland, or possible swelling of the prostate gland, that impinges on this prostatic urethra, thereby slowing the flow of urine. Alright, so that's called benign prostatic hyperplasia. And oh, we didn't get to talk about the micturition reflex. And okay, so the micturition reflex, how do we know? Okay, we know that we have to relax both sphincters, but there is a little like reflex involved in this. Now, a brief refresher on reflexes. So like our patellar reflex, what we have here is like some sort of stimulus, and this is going to be carried via these sensory or afferent neurons, go to our central nervous system, and then end up looping back to some sort of motor neuron that causes an effect, or effector neuron or efferent neuron. So this is why, like for the knee jerk reflex, what we have is like you hit this tendon over here, it causes stretch. That stretch is sensed by the sensory neuron. It goes to the spinal cord, and again, this happens without even thinking because it actually synapses with the motor neuron on the same level, and then it causes contraction of the quadriceps muscles that move and cause that kicking due to that knee-jerk reflex. Again, the involvement of the brain is not necessary. But with the micturition reflex, what we have, again, are two internal and external urethral sphincters. So when we have our bladder filling up, what's that going to do? So what it's going to do is send this stretch, or what we call distension, is going to be felt by these sensory neurons that detect stretch. And these sensory neurons are stretch receptors, and they're going to actually synapse back onto the internal urethral sphincter, so via these parasympathetic nerves. Now, why parasympathetic? Again, parasympathetic is the rest and digest, but also diuresis and defecation as well. So this internal urethral sphincter is going to automatically relax. So it's kind of like that digestive system, right? Like the digestive system, the internal sphincter, it relaxes when it senses some sort of pressure. Similar thing happens with the urinary system. So we have the first seal open, but you don't want that thing leaking out automatically just because your bladder is full. Otherwise, we wouldn't be able to control, and we'd just like have leakage whenever we have a full bladder. So luckily, we have our external urethral sphincter. Now, how do you relax that? Well, the thing, or actually, before we even get to the external urethral sphincter, is that there's another part of this receptor, this reflex over here. So it's not just about relaxing the internal urethral sphincter. It also causes the contraction of the muscle that surrounds the bladder. So when you have a contraction of the muscle, this is going to contract it and cause it to squeeze on that urine that's stored in your bladder. So remember what happens when you try to decrease the volume of an enclosed space. If you decrease the volume, that increases the pressure. So now you have increased pressure and you have a relaxed internal urethral sphincter. It's time to go. So what you have to do is, like, these stretch receptors, thankfully it's not just reflexes, it also sends signals up to your brain. So even though this part down here doesn't involve the brain, it does send signals, sensory signals up to the brain that tells you, hey, your bladder's full, it's stretched, it's contracting, it's time to go. So this is where you can go find a place that's safe to urinate, hopefully a bathroom. So this is like, yep, that's the warning signal right there. So when, say you're in a bathroom now, it's safe to go, what can you do? So now the brain can send signals back to, so the brain can send, you can actually cause contraction of your bladder by helping send signals to say, okay, we're going to help move this along, increase the pressure so that we have faster flow of urine. So, and then you're also going to have relaxation, send signals that relax that external urethral sphincter. So now you can relieve the pressure, now you can finally get rid of that urine. All right, and let's see. Actually, let's go on with this one. So why is it good to use it before giving birth? Why is it a good idea to use the bathroom before giving birth? So yeah, it's like, I mean, usually she wouldn't be this calm about this, but it's like, oh, it's about time. It's like, yeah, let's check if you use the bathroom, and why might you want to do that before giving birth? Well, let's look at the female reproductive system again. So where is the bladder? That is the most anterior part. And where's the uterus? That's right above and behind it. So what if you have a big old baby in there? Well, what's that baby going to do? And this is why often we have like incontinence in pregnant people, because why? We have all this mass sitting on top of this bladder right here. So that's going to cause that's going to increase the pressure. So this is why it's like increased urge and sometimes leakage and incontinence due to this increased pressure that's carried over here. Now, that's one thing that's affecting the urinary system, but I love this tweet. So yeah, what did your wife do before she had the baby? She went and a little bit of poo came out. Work-wise. Oh, bookkeeping. Yeah, so why does that happen? Well, it's like natural, because what do we have in the back and posterior? If we have this baby being delivered vaginally, yeah, it's going to squeeze the bladder for sure. But what do we have in the back? We have the rectum and we have the anus. So if when this baby comes out, what's going to happen? It's also going to cause pressure toward the anterior and also pressure toward the posterior as well. So whatever content's in there, that's going to come out with it, because basically the rectum is being squeezed like a toothpaste tube, and anything that's in it is also going to be squeezed along with it. So this is why it's like totally natural. It's like there's this article. It's like it's almost normal. It's 100% normal to poop. Why? And also another thing that can complicate it is like if you give anesthesia, that epidural anesthesia, so that you can't really feel. I mean, I can't say just like from secondhand experience and what people who have given birth say, they say like they can't feel anything down there. So they're like saying, so it's not only not feeling things and not feeling the pain, but when you have that epidural anesthesia, that also affects voluntary control as well. So can you really hold on to the external urethral sphincter and the external anal sphincter when you have anesthesia blocking those motor signals? So this is why it's totally normal, even though it's embarrassing. Like this, if you read the article, she's just like, I know I had proof. Yeah, but again, it's natural, especially with if you add anesthesia to the equation, because it's like, well, you can't control. There's pressures. Like when you're delivering vaginally, then now you have pressures on both ends, and if you have voluntary control, then what happens is what happens naturally. That's life. That's the life cycle. All right. So that's it for now, and we'll cover the nephron, because nephron is something that is, I want to scare everybody, but even med school, even med students know how much of a beast the nephron is. So I'll tell you what, we'll cover more about the specifics of the kidney in the next lecture, but enjoy your break. We just covered the basics right now, and enjoy your weekend. See you all on Monday.